Across the history of scientific discovery, there have always been breakthroughs that surface briefly before vanishing ideas glimpsed in public for a moment, then quietly withdrawn, rewritten, or absorbed into research programs that no longer welcome outside scrutiny. Sometimes the work is abandoned, sometimes it proves too volatile, too ethically fraught, or too revealing, and sometimes it slips behind locked doors for reasons no one will openly explain. Filmmakers have long drawn creative fuel from this borderland between documented science and its hidden counterpart. Studios seek out researchers with unusual specialties, consult unpublished drafts, and borrow fragments of theories still in formative stages. Most of the time, these influences remain harmless embellishments, background details meant to give fictional worlds a sense of authenticity. But occasionally, a movie ends up preserving concepts that later disappear from the public sphere, leaving the film as one of the last visible traces of research that once existed openly. When this happens, the signs are subtle but unmistakable. Technical diagrams that resemble early prototypes no longer referenced, terminology that once appeared in accessible journals but now survives only in citations, advisors who quietly distance themselves after the film's release. Entire research threads seem to dissolve from view, replaced by vague references or reorganized into programs with restricted access. This episode explores 15 sci-fi films whose scientific foundations intersect with research trajectories that were later sealed, suppressed, or quietly reclassified. Whether these parallels arose by coincidence, intuition, or direct consultation, each film appears to echo a moment when speculative ideas overlapped with real, soon-to-be-hidden discoveries. The question isn't whether these movies predicted anything. The deeper mystery is whether they momentarily revealed pieces of work that someone later decided should no longer be part of the public record. 1. The Matrix 1999. While The Matrix is praised for philosophical depth and stylistic innovation, its depiction of neural interfacing and synthetic perception aligns with cognitive research that was surprisingly accessible in the late 1990 seconds before being reshaped or withdrawn. At the time, neuroscientists were exploring early-stage models for reconstructing sensory environments from neural signals. Papers discussed synthetic stimulus substitution, perceptual reconstruction loops, and the feasibility of translating neural activity into immersive artificial input. Many of these documents were available in pre-digital university libraries before being replaced with truncated summaries. During script preparation, the filmmakers consulted researchers investigating high-density neural mapping and dynamic consciousness modeling. These advisors shared conceptual sketches for closed-loop perception systems, which influenced the film's iconic jack-in interface. Years later, some of these sketches were associated with a research effort that had since undergone classification review. The original drafts are no longer publicly accessible. The film's simulation glitches moments where reality appears to recompute mirror hypothetical discussions from a rarely cited workshop on environment rendering in neural simulation architectures. Attendees recalled that the workshop materials were never formally published and that several presenters stopped distributing their drafts soon afterward. Another curious thread involves a cognitive engineering advisor who quietly withdrew from all promotional involvement. He claimed that the models used during early consultations had shifted into programs where public transparency no longer applied. His colleagues confirmed that his research group had undergone reorganization around the same time. Even more intriguing is the resemblance between the Matrix's artificial sensory feed and a discontinued research program that attempted to generate coherent perceptual fields from layered neural data. Little remains of that program besides scattered references and citations pointing to documents that no longer exist. Seen today, The Matrix feels like a relic of scientific possibilities that were once briefly visible. Its portrayal of a fully simulated world resonates with research trajectories that later vanished into restricted, privatized, or classified domains, leaving the film as one of the last surviving echoes of ideas withdrawn from public knowledge. 15. The Andromeda Strain 1971. When The Andromeda Strain was released, audiences were struck by its near-clinical realism, its sterile chambers, multi-level containment systems, and oddly precise depictions of biological hazard procedures. That uncanny accuracy came from more than imagination. During the film's early development, the production team contacted researchers who were working on speculative biodefense concepts related to unknown microbial threats. At that time, these studies existed in an unusual gray zone, technically public but rarely cited, tucked inside obscure symposium proceedings and early drafts, exploring how laboratories might respond to unclassified biological anomalies. Only a few years after the film premiered, many of those same documents began disappearing. Papers on automated decontamination cycles, high-pressure isolation vaults, and micro-pattern tracking were withdrawn, replaced with softened abstracts that avoided the original technical details. University collections that once stored preliminary biocontainment notes quietly removed them during archival reorganizations. One lab, rumored to have exchanged correspondence with the film's advisors, underwent structural changes, and its earliest publications were absorbed into a larger, unnamed research initiative. Even more curious is the film's depiction of sophisticated lab robotics, mechanical arms, sealed analysis chambers, and automated diagnostic interfaces. These systems resemble experimental designs that did not appear publicly until much later. A consultant involved in guiding those concepts refused to elaborate in later interviews, stating that the material no longer matched what is available to the public. A journalist who attempted to track down another scientific contact discovered he had stopped discussing his involvement altogether. His only comment, "The references we used aren't in circulation anymore." 2 Moon, 2009. Although Moon is praised for its minimalist intensity, the film's themes overlap surprisingly well with experimental cloning and tissue replication studies that briefly appeared in the mid-2000s. During that period, several labs investigated accelerated development cycles, epigenetic stabilization across artificially derived tissues, and methods for maintaining psychological continuity in engineered organisms. These explorations were discussed in early symposium papers, but later disappeared from open-access archives. The filmmakers consulted researchers familiar with cellular memory imprinting and somatic reprogramming thresholds. Their guidance helped shape the film's unsettling concept of workers who are genetically identical yet psychologically fragmented. Not long after the movie debuted, documents referencing rapid clone maturation and inherited memory traces were removed from university catalogs or replaced with heavily generalized summaries. One particularly striking parallel is the film's use of clones exhibiting structured emotional drift. This mirrors a controversial 2007 study exploring emotional response retention in replicated biological systems. The study was never formally published. Preliminary notes were circulated briefly and then withdrawn. Researchers involved later stated only that the work had been redirected. The sterile, automated facility depicted in the film also echoes descriptions of a short-lived industrial biology project that investigated cost-effective replication environments. Records of that initiative were later consolidated under a private organization, and all prior documentation vanished from the original host institutions. A scientific consultant tied to the movie later refrained from discussing his involvement. Colleagues hinted he was assigned to a program with revised disclosure rules, limiting what he could reference publicly. Viewed in hindsight, Moon stands as a quiet reflection of scientific directions that retreated from public view just as the film immortalized similar ideas. Its haunting portrayal of identity and engineered labor aligns with research threads that flickered into visibility before disappearing into private or classified domains. 3 Interstellar, 2014. Interstellar is celebrated for its emotional ambition, yet its scientific architecture reflects theoretical physics drafts that circulated only briefly before disappearing from accessible channels. In the early 2010s, a handful of research teams explored unconventional gravitational models frameworks involving warped space-time geometries, density fold transitions, and hypothetical transit corridors that resembled wormhole structures. These ideas were occasionally mentioned in small conferences or uploaded as preliminary papers, only to be withdrawn or redirected into ambiguous continued review programs. During the film's development, the creative team collaborated with physicists who were deeply engaged in these speculative realms. They offered insights into complex gravitational interactions and field distortion behavior. Crew members recalled seeing early diagrams that mapped curvature shifts in multidimensional space diagrams later associated with a proposal submitted to a national science agency. That proposal vanished from public databases sometime after 2015, leaving only fragmented references. The film's Tesseract sequence parallels discussions from a now unpublished workshop session focused on treating time as a spatial coordinate within higher dimensional modeling. Attendees later described the session as deeply theoretical, noting that the visual aids were collected immediately afterward. None of the diagrams from that presentation were ever made accessible. Even the film's portrayal of time dilation near massive objects echoes draft calculations that briefly appeared in a university repository before being pulled without explanation. Some physicists speculated that the removal was part of a shift towards specialized internal research. A consultant who guided early scientific conversations declined to elaborate after the movie's release, stating only that the mathematics we explored then isn't something I can discuss in its original form now. Seen today, Interstellar feels like more than a cinematic translation of theoretical physics. It resembles a rare window into scientific explorations that briefly surfaced, intersected with Hollywood, and then quietly slipped into restricted territory, leaving the film as one of the last public echoes of research trajectories that vanished soon after. 4. The Terminator, 1984. Despite its dystopian framing, The Terminator draws from early robotics and machine vision experiments that circulated in technical communities before being removed or rewritten. In the early 1980 seconds, engineers explored primitive autonomous targeting systems, sensor-driven threat identification, and closed-loop motor control mechanisms. These prototypes were early and imprecise, but they formed the groundwork for ideas that resemble the Terminator's relentless precision. Some of this research appeared briefly in academic publications. Terms such as isolated threat evaluation modules, adaptive sensor networks, and pattern-driven acquisition logic were used in preliminary drafts. But in the years following the film's release, these documents were revised, relocated, or removed from university and defense-accessible repositories. Several teams researching advanced targeting heuristics were reorganized under new program names, with their earlier work no longer visible. The film's distinctive point of view targeting display scrolling diagnostics, multi-spectrum overlays, and geometric alignment grids mirrors a set of leaked images from an early machine vision HUD project. The images existed online only briefly before takedown notices removed them. Witnesses described the leaked interface as strikingly similar to the cinematic interpretation. Another piece of the puzzle involves an engineer listed informally on early production notes. His name vanished from later materials, and former co-workers suggested he had worked on a program evaluating semi-autonomous field robotics. After the film's release, he declined to discuss the subject further, saying only that the research direction changed, and so did the rules about discussing it. Internal memos from the Cold War era speculated about the potential for autonomous battlefield algorithms, documents that once seemed like academic exercises but disappeared from archives by the late 1980 seconds. Today, the Terminator stands as a stylized, heightened reflection of early autonomy research. Though fictional, its technological backbone aligns with experimental robotics efforts that flickered into public view only briefly before being absorbed into classified or proprietary initiatives. 5 War Games, 1983. Although War Games presents itself as a Cold War thriller about accidental nuclear escalation, its portrayal of automated command systems overlaps with early strategic computation experiments that were once partially visible. In the late 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds, research groups evaluated whether complex military decisions could be modeled through recursive algorithms. Draft papers discussed multi-branch conflict resolution, probabilistic escalation mapping, and adaptive decision sequences. These materials circulated among analysts before disappearing or being heavily revised. During the film's script development, consultants who worked on decision theory models provided the creative team with insights into automated conflict assessment logic. Shortly after the movie's release, many related documents were withdrawn from open archives. Technical reports, once describing computational escalation loops, were replaced with downgraded versions containing broad generalities. Research projects that had once been publicly referenced moved under restructured funding lines with limited disclosure. The design of the WOPR interface, glowing matrices, branching conflict diagrams, and recursive scenario visualizations resembles early strategic simulation prototypes rumored to have been tested in closed defense facilities. Leaked documents from this period included decision flow maps nearly identical to those shown in the film. The leaks vanished rapidly, with only blurred captures remaining in secondary sources. One of the advisors involved early in the film's development later departed from public academic work. Colleagues hinted he joined a program that adopted new classification rules, restricting discussion of algorithmic prediction frameworks. Early drafts of the script reportedly included more specific examples of automated decision cycles, but these were removed after a consultant insisted the details mirrored a prototype that shouldn't appear even in fictional form. Viewed today, War Games feels like an unintended glimpse into research directions that briefly surfaced before being sealed away. Its narrative may be fictional, but its computational logic echoes vanished documents and early experiments that quietly disappeared from public discourse soon after the film's debut. 6. Edge of Tomorrow, 2014. Although Edge of Tomorrow frames its story around an impossible time loop, the film's depiction of rapid tactical recalculation aligns with several battlefield prediction concepts that circulated briefly in military research circles. In the late 2000s, certain simulation groups experimented with real-time scenario branching engines, systems capable of generating thousands of micro-outcomes based on shifting environmental and enemy variables. These works appeared in limited technical papers that discussed dynamic combat projection, scenario remapping, and probability-driven engagement forecasting. During the film's development, consultants familiar with these models provided insight into how a battlefield might adapt if recalculated at extreme speed. Not long after, references to these papers began disappearing. Some journals replaced them with heavily edited summaries. Others removed them entirely, noting updates to access protocols. Even the phrase temporal scenario clustering, once found in niche conference notes, stopped appearing in publicly available discussions. The movie's visualization of combat data, arrows shifting, vectors reorienting, and threat trajectories reconfiguring bears a striking resemblance to an experimental interface briefly demonstrated during a closed simulation symposium. Attendees described the system as unnervingly predictive, capable of suggesting advantageous moves faster than human operators could process. That prototype has since disappeared, with no formal record of its existence. Also noteworthy is the similarity between the mimic's hive-like coordination and a rumored study exploring emergent behavior in distributed autonomous drone units. A set of leaked images from that study displayed motion patterns nearly identical to the creature formations seen in the film. Those images were rapidly taken down, leaving behind only low-resolution remnants on archived forums. One technical advisor eventually requested his name be removed from production materials, stating that the research he initially discussed had entered a phase where open commentary wasn't appropriate. Today, Edge of Tomorrow reads as more than entertainment. It reflects fleeting glimpses of predictive combat models that were shown publicly only briefly before fading into classified or compartmentalized research environments. 7. Transcendence, 2014. Transcendence imagines consciousness uploaded into a vast computational network, yet much of its scientific texture resembles exploratory neuroscience that briefly emerged before becoming difficult to trace. In the early 2010 seconds, researchers examined ultra-detailed neural mapping, high-density connectome analysis, and techniques aimed at capturing persistent cognitive states in complex data structures. These efforts were speculative but circulated among small scientific communities through unpublished drafts and internal conference talks. The filmmakers consulted advisors familiar with these frontiers, discussing theoretical models that envisioned consciousness as a dynamic pattern distributed across interlinked neural groups. Shortly after the film's release, however, several papers exploring extended-state neural modeling disappeared from public archives. Others resurfaced with heavily condensed abstracts that omitted technical methodologies. The film's depiction of the evolving digital mind, growing, reorganizing, and rewriting its architecture parallels theoretical exercises once shared among cognitive simulation researchers. These exercises proposed that a sufficiently detailed neural reconstruction could generate emergent substructures. The workshops where these discussions occurred ceased releasing proceedings after 2014. The movie's intricate visualization of expanding neural lattices resembles diagrams from a rarely referenced session on multidimensional cognitive encoding. Attendees described the diagrams as too ambitious and noted that the presenter's materials were collected immediately afterward, never made public. A scientific consultant affiliated with the film's early development later withdrew from promotional interviews. When asked about the research underlying the story, he remarked that the relevant conversations changed direction and could no longer be openly discussed. Today, Transcendence seems like a cinematic echo of neural architecture exploration that briefly reached the surface before slipping behind institutional walls. Its portrayal of a consciousness transcending biology may be fiction, but the scientific roots beneath it trace back to research that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving the film as one of the last public reflections of those early, now unreachable ideas. 8. Minority Report, 2002. Although Minority Report is remembered for its visionary aesthetic, its predictive policing foundations align with early behavioral forecasting research that was only briefly accessible before being obscured. Around the late 1992s and early 2000s, several research groups pursued algorithms intended to anticipate human behavior using layered data, environmental factors, social context markers, and probabilistic pattern extraction. These projects appeared in specialized papers, hinting at the feasibility of predicting high-risk outcomes through complex modeling. During the film's creation, the production team met with analysts who were experimenting with early probability mapping engines. Some of the visual language in the film's pre-crime system, its branching timelines and dynamic outcome trees, reflects diagrams shown in limited circulation research summaries. Those summaries were later removed from online archives, replaced with notices referencing archival realignment. Even the film's gesture-based user interface holds surprising historical parallels. At least one experimental lab was known to be developing prototypes that combined gesture recognition with multi-layer forecasting grids. These prototypes were shown briefly at a closed workshop, after which references to the project disappeared. Researchers attending the workshop noted the resemblance between their internal tools and what eventually appeared on screen. Another intriguing connection involves a set of images that leaked online in 2003, depicting situational trajectory mapping. The glowing nodes and branching probability lines were nearly identical to those featured in the film. The images were removed almost immediately, with no explanation beyond a generic takedown notice. A consultant associated with the screenplay later stated that some of the inspiration came from documents that don't exist anymore. He declined to elaborate. Viewed today, Minority Report seems less like a speculative fiction piece and more like a stylized mirror of early predictive behavior research work that briefly surfaced before being folded into controlled access programs, leaving the film as one of the clearest public remnants of ideas now hidden. 9. Ex Machina, 2014. Ex Machina is often praised for its intimacy and restraint, yet its depiction of self-evolving artificial intelligence connects eerily well to AI research projects that briefly appeared in academic circles before being withdrawn. In the early 2010 seconds, several labs investigated adaptive cognitive engines capable of generating their own behavioral strategies, systems designed not just to learn from data, but to reframe their internal logic in response to unpredictable stimuli. These early-stage models circulated as preprints for a short time, highlighting experiments in non-verbal inference and emotional pattern decoding before disappearing from public repositories. While the film was in development, the production team consulted AI specialists exploring nuanced interpersonal modeling. Their research involved micro-expression tracking, linguistic rhythm mapping, and predictive behavioral clustering. Strangely, many of the documents describing these systems were removed or replaced with minimal abstracts in subsequent years. One research group that had once shared progress openly transitioned into a new, unnamed partnership, and all previous publications tied to emergent behavioral modeling were quietly retired. A particularly striking connection is the film's portrayal of Ava's near-flawless ability to read human intent. This mirrors a real behavioral prediction algorithm tested under a small defense contract. The algorithm evaluated emotional trajectories using neural networks trained on subtle physical cues. A brief leaked summary of the project surfaced online in 2013, but vanished within days. The visual logic portrayed in the film's mapping sequences seems almost identical to descriptions of that algorithm's internal structure. There was also an advisor involved early in the film's research phase who later asked not to be credited. According to crew accounts, he had provided insights based on computational models that were not meant for public circulation. After his name was removed, he declined to discuss the film further. Seen today, Ex Machina feels like more than a meditation on consciousness. It appears to preserve fragments from an era when AI research crossed into territories later deemed too sensitive for open discussion, its quiet tension reflecting scientific work that slipped behind restricted access walls soon after. The world glimpsed their fictionalized echoes. 10. Upgrade, 2018. Upgrade dazzles with its kinetic energy, but the deeper fascination lies in how closely its neural implant concept resembles early neurotechnology efforts from the mid-2010 seconds. During this period, laboratories were testing adaptive brain-machine interfaces capable of interpreting intention signals and redirecting them into controlled motor outputs. These prototypes were publicly discussed in open conferences, suggesting a future in which neural implants might assist patients with severe motor impairment. But alongside these public demonstrations existed quieter research threads, drafts exploring semi-autonomous neural support modules, rapid response cortical analysis, and predictive motor override algorithms. Some of these studies appeared briefly in niche publications before being removed or superseded by redacted versions. Labs that once showcased high-bandwidth neural decoding gradually shifted to limited disclosures, citing proprietary partnerships and new oversight mandates. The film's depiction of a chip that can overrule human hesitation is particularly striking. It aligns closely with rumored internal documents describing reflex augmentation modules, experimental systems capable of instant threat response optimization. These documents leaked momentarily in 2016 before disappearing. Set design notes for the movie's implant interface resemble diagrams from a short-lived research project exploring closed-loop neural correction systems, diagrams referenced once in a symposium slide deck and never published. A technical advisor, attached early in production, withdrew from credit, reportedly because some models used for conceptual grounding were no longer part of public discourse. Crew members recalled seeing diagrams illustrating invasive neural override protocols that were more advanced than anything available publicly. Viewed today, Upgrade feels less like a bold extrapolation and more like a stylized echo of research that briefly revealed too much before tightening behind restricted channels. Its vision of a human-guided, then overtaken by a neural implant reflects scientific avenues that flickered into view and then quietly disappeared. 11. The Fly, 1986. Though The Fly is remembered for its visceral transformation, its scientific core reflects conceptual research that briefly gained attention before slipping into obscurity. During the early 1980 seconds, a handful of biophysics researchers explored theoretical approaches to extreme biological scanning ideas about reducing living organisms into encoded structural data, mapping cell-level patterns with unprecedented resolution. These studies were never mainstream, but circulated as draft papers and speculative memos in biology departments, pushing the boundaries of molecular analysis. As the film entered development, the creative team consulted individuals familiar with emergent concepts in cellular decomposition analysis and micropattern reconstruction. Their insights shaped the stark, metallic interiors of the teleportation pods and the unsettling emphasis on biological precision. But within a few years of the film's release, many of the documents referencing those early experiments disappeared from accessible archives. Some studies on complex structural deconstruction were temporarily withdrawn and never returned. Others reappeared, stripped of their original methodology. What is especially notable is how the pod designs mirror experimental apparatus described in a little-known dissertation on molecular imprinting devices. That dissertation existed briefly in physical university archives before quietly vanishing during digitization. Multiple researchers later acknowledged its existence but insisted its details could no longer be retrieved. One consultant who initially offered input on biological plausibility asked for his name to be removed from promotional materials. Colleagues reported that he had recently become involved in a research initiative that underwent classification review. His only statement, when contacted years later, was, "We were discussing concepts that positioned us closer to the edge than we realized." Even though the fly dramatizes its science with grotesque intensity, the foundation underneath aligns with speculative experiments that faded soon after they surfaced. The film stands today as a haunting echo of scientific questions that briefly touched the boundary between theoretical biology and uncharted, now inaccessible territory. 12 Gattaca, 1997. When Gattaca arrived in the late 1990s, most viewers saw a cautionary fable about genetic inequality. Yet beneath its sleek dystopian architecture lies a striking resemblance to speculative genetic selection research that circulated briefly before receding from public access. In the mid-90s, several biomedical groups explored probabilistic genome forecasting, genetic risk modeling, and theoretical frameworks for pre-implantation evaluation. These ideas were experimental and controversial, but they appeared for a brief window in technical reports and early-stage grant proposals. During the film's preparation, the production reached out to researchers studying genotype-phenotype prediction and developmental viability modeling. Their insights informed the film's unsettling scoring systems and classification charts. But not long after Gattaca's release, a number of documents relating to these methods began disappearing from online repositories. Papers discussing genomic ethics guidelines were rewritten with softer language. Drafts outlining early viability algorithms vanished from university databases, replaced by ambiguous abstracts. A now dormant research proposal dealing with predictive hereditary optimization, once accessible, bears uncanny similarity to the film's selection charts. That proposal has since disappeared entirely. Some scientists connected to the early drafts stopped presenting their findings, citing changes in oversight requirements. Another notable parallel involves experiments on epigenetic memory tendencies, which briefly emerged around 1996-1997. Preliminary notes mentioned the possibility of biological markers influencing long-term behavioral predispositions. The project dissolved soon after, leaving only fragmentary references in later publications. One researcher rumored to have discussed early ideas with the filmmakers later avoided all interviews. When asked about the underlying concepts, he responded, "Those frameworks evolved into areas that are no longer openly reviewed." Today, Gattaca reads like an accidental archive of scientific directions that were once speculative but public before being reorganized, privatized, or muted. Its carefully controlled world of engineered identities echoes research threads that faded just as the film immortalized their possibilities. 13. Contact 1997. While Contact is often remembered for its emotional scale and cosmic wonder, many of its technological elements align with high-energy physics proposals that emerged briefly in the early 1990s before fading from public view. During pre-production, the creative team consulted researchers exploring nonlinear energy fields, rotational harmonic structures, and speculative propulsion based on exotic spacetime interactions. These ideas appeared in early workshop papers and grant drafts documents that were publicly accessible for only a short period. Soon after the film's release, several of the same research threads began disappearing. A proposal that included rotational energy transfer diagrams, remarkably similar to the film's machine schematics, was removed from federal grant listings. Another paper exploring multi-axis magnetic containment fields reappeared years later in a heavily edited version stripped of its original mathematics. University libraries that once stored preliminary models of exotic field harmonics replaced them with placeholder notices. A scientific consultant originally credited with helping the production visualize the machine's oscillating geometry quietly distanced himself from promotional materials. Crew members recalled that he had shown them examples of field interaction models that weren't meant to be circulated widely. When approached later, he declined to discuss the matter, noting only that the research had moved into a different category. The film's intricate visualizations, a lattice of nested rings, channeling fluctuating energy echo illustrations from a vanished conference presentation on unconventional field stabilization. Attendees described the diagrams but confirmed that no official record was released afterward. Carl Sagan's personal notes include cryptic references to conversations with physicists who expressed constraints over what they were allowed to disclose. Some hinted that related studies were undergoing classification review. Today, Contact feels like a cinematic remnant of scientific drafts that briefly brushed the surface before disappearing into sealed archives. Its visionary machine may be fiction, but the research threads behind it seem to have evaporated too neatly to dismiss as coincidence. 14. Colossus, the Forbin Project, 1970. Though Colossus, the Forbin Project presents a futuristic supercomputer seizing global control, its inner logic mirrors real computational frameworks being assembled in the late 1960s. At that time, several defense-oriented research groups were quietly experimenting with automated threat evaluation systems, primitive models designed to assess incoming data and generate rapid strategic responses faster than human operators could. Brief mentions of these prototypes surfaced in period journals, describing algorithmic escalation maps and recursive scenario analysis. Not long after the film generated public conversation, many of those documents were revised or removed entirely. Reports referencing autonomous command structures were republished with vague terminology. Others vanished from conference catalogs. Even the expression automated oversight doctrine, which appeared in early drafts associated with the film's development, later disappeared from technical literature. The movie's diagrams, flashing network matrices, and decision branch displays bear a striking resemblance to a classified prototype known to have existed inside a defense laboratory. Researchers familiar with that program later noted that certain sequences in the film looked uncomfortably similar to diagrams that were not widely circulated. A mathematician who briefly collaborated with the film's writers eventually withdrew from public commentary, hinting that the project he had worked on had since shifted into a compartmented environment. By the early 1980s, nearly all early research on strategic automation architecture was reorganized into new programs with restricted reporting. References to the original models were scrubbed from institutional libraries. Only scattered citations remain, often pointing to missing documents. Viewed today, Colossus feels less like simple cautionary fiction and more like a stylized echo of early decision automation work that slipped behind closed doors. The film's cold, deterministic logic reflects a research lineage erased almost as soon as the public unknowingly glimpsed its outlines. 15. The Andromeda Strain, 1971. When the Andromeda Strain was released, audiences were struck by its near-clinical realism, its sterile chambers, multi-level containment systems, and oddly precise depictions of biological hazard procedures. That uncanny accuracy came from more than imagination. During the film's early development, the production team contacted researchers who were working on speculative biodefense concepts related to unknown microbial threats. At that time, these studies existed in an unusual gray zone, technically public but rarely cited, tucked inside obscure symposium proceedings and early drafts, exploring how laboratories might respond to unclassified biological anomalies. Only a few years after the film premiered, many of those same documents began disappearing. Papers on automated decontamination cycles, high-pressure isolation vaults, and micropattern tracking were withdrawn, replaced with softened abstracts that avoided the original technical details. University collections that once stored preliminary biocontainment notes quietly removed them during archival reorganizations. One lab, rumored to have exchanged correspondence with the film's advisors, underwent structural changes, and its earliest publications were absorbed into a larger, unnamed research initiative. Even more curious is the film's depiction of sophisticated lab robotics, mechanical arms, sealed analysis chambers, and automated diagnostic interfaces. These systems resemble experimental designs that did not appear publicly until much later. A consultant involved in guiding those concepts refused to elaborate in later interviews, stating that the material no longer matched what is available to the public. Next 4. What is always the Stappers of the Danid? A journalist who attempted to track down another scientific contact discovered he had stopped discussing his involvement altogether. His only comment, "The references we used aren't in circulation anymore." Today, the Andromeda Strain feels like a cinematic artifact of research that flickered into view only to vanish behind restricted channels. Its detailed laboratories and procedural precision may not simply be movie-craft, they may reflect a scientific moment preserved on film long after the original research faded into secrecy. Bonus: The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. Among the visionary films of the 1972, The Man Who Fell to Earth stands out not only for its surreal tone, but for its uncanny resemblance to experimental technologies that circulated briefly before evaporating from the scientific record. During that decade, a handful of research groups explored unconventional optical composites, high-frequency energy routing, and speculative systems for ultra-efficient power transmission. These efforts appeared in a few obscure papers and technical bulletins, often described with minimal detail and no follow-up publications. The film's alien devices' layered surfaces, refractive geometries, and shimmering structures mirror sketches from a now-lost research proposal concerned with structured photonic conduits. Attendees at a small 1,974 symposium recalled diagrams showing nested lattice components engineered to channel multispectrum energy. Those diagrams were never officially published, and the proposal itself vanished from institutional archives soon after the event. Even more striking is the film's depiction of rapid, compressed data transfer bursts. This concept parallels a discontinued communication study that attempted to encode vast information in condensed multi-frequency pulses. The study was absorbed into a larger program the following year, and all references to its original findings disappeared. A physicist who provided background insight for the film once mentioned that he had shown the production team early drafts from a materials experiment that no longer exists in open literature. When asked years later whether the drafts had been classified, he replied simply, "They're not available to the public, and that's all I can say." Seen through a modern lens, The Man Who Fell to Earth feels like a cinematic fossil preserving faint outlines of scientific directions that flickered into view before retreating into restricted or proprietary research corridors. Rather than pure invention, the film's alien technology may represent the last surviving reflections of ideas deliberately erased from the scientific timeline. If these films truly captured fragments of research that later slipped out of public reach, then each one becomes more than a story. They become remnants of scientific paths that someone quietly redirected into places we're not meant to follow. And if cinema can preserve what the official record erases, it raises a deeper question: how much of what we call fiction is simply evidence left behind? If you want more explorations of erased experiments, hidden technologies, and the films that accidentally revealed them, subscribe to Vaulted Futures and keep digging into the archives they tried to bury.